Welcome. I see that we have a couple of attendees, but it is 4:59, so we're just going to give it a few minutes here, probably till about 5:02 before we get started. So I'll go ahead and mute, but thank you to those of you who are here already. Thank you to everyone who's come in so far. We're just going to give it about another 2 minutes. We'll get started at 5:02. So it's 5 o'clock now, probably about another 90 seconds just to give people a chance to get settled in and get here. Thank you to those who have joined. It's 5:01. We're going to go ahead and get started at 5:02. So we'll just give it another minute before we get started. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here tonight. My name is Rebecca Miner, and I am the interim superintendent for Edmonds School District currently, and have been selected as the superintendent going forward, which I'm very honored and excited about. Tonight, Lydia and I have the opportunity to share some information about school district budgets. Because this is virtual, I'm going to go over a couple of the ways we're going to manage this, but why don't we do our land acknowledgement first, Lydia, if you could advance the slide just a little bit for me there. We acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Snohomish people and their successors, the Laylock tribes, who since time immemorial have taken care of, hunted, fished, and gathered on these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and we honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. By acknowledging these homelands, we are also committed to working with tribal nations to further the education aims they have identified in our classrooms and schools. So thank you for that, Lydia. And you can see on the map where we are. Some of you may be in other traditional lands at this time, depending on where you're zooming in from. So this evening, during the presentation, as Lydia is going through her presentation, I encourage you to put your questions into chat. My role tonight for the first half of the presentation will be to monitor chat. Lydia will pause periodically to let me ask questions, let me share your questions, or else I might have to hop in there if we get going a little too fast, but Lydia and I have a pretty good rapport after a few of these presentations, so hopefully she won't mind. And then for the second half, because this is a webinar, it's not interactive. The only way you can communicate with us is through the Q&A. We're going to put at the end of Lydia's section of the presentation, we're going to put a Zoom link in there. And I'll explain what we're going to do with that Zoom link. And you can decide if you'd like to come on to the second portion, which will be more interactive. And I'll be putting you into small group rooms at that time to do an activity that will give us information about your thoughts about key functions of the school district. But again, I'll go over that and you can make an informed decision at that time. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Lydia. Thank you so much.
So thank you for everybody who has joined this evening. My name is Lydia Sully. I'm the Executive Director of Business and Finance and work with Dr. Miner to craft the budget for the following year. So a little bit of overview of how a school district budget works is there's actually 5 funds in a school district. The focus of this evening is on the general fund, but I briefly wanted to touch on the other 4 funds so that you understand what they are and the fact that they don't really mix and match. So they have to reside in their own set of accounts. So I'll go backwards. We have the Transportation Vehicle Fund, which is only for the purchase or major repair of yellow school buses. So this is not for tires or oil or bus drivers, but just to purchase school buses. Hopefully major repair at that point, we would probably just get a new one. Back in 2014, our voters authorized a bond measure to pay for some capital improvements. The debt service fund, its only function is to pay for the principal and interest on those bonds semi-annually. The capital projects fund, more people are familiar with. This is land, buildings, significant renovations, and it has its own source of funds, which is predominantly those bonds that I talked about, as well as we have capital levies and what's called state match, or is known as state match. Those funds, you see those every several years, asking for funds for capital projects, and those monies are to be used for those exact purposes and can't be used for our daily operations. Associated student body, that's student accounts. Basically, students decide how those funds are raised and how those funds are spent. We are basically the banker for the students, and those accounts are also not used for our daily operations. So outside of those 4 purposes or accounts, the general fund in a school district does everything else. So that's where I will focus the rest of the conversation. So over 50% of our general fund revenues is determined by our enrollment. So not only the number of students that are in our district, but the time they actually spend in school. So if a student takes 6 periods a day, say in high school, we receive more funding from the state than a student who maybe takes 5 periods or 4. So one of the things we've noticed was the pandemic, unfortunately, has taken a toll on our enrollment, as well as lower birth rates and some other factors. So the scale, the legend is a little bit off from the chart, but you will see on the far left-hand side, in January of 17, our enrollment was just under 19,330 full-time equivalent. Now, keep in mind, this excludes alternative learning experiences, Running Start, and EdCap, which is a program that is housed at the college. So our basic students in our K-12 classrooms, 19,330, dipped a little bit in January, extremely stable in January of 19. We saw a slight uptick in January of 20, and then recall March 20 is when we were directed to shut down schools. So the following year, 2021, we saw a large decrease in enrollment, even though we offered remote learning opportunities. So in 21-22, things were getting a little bit more normal, or we felt, but enrollment decreased a little bit more. So this red bar going across is where we predicted 22-23 enrollment would come in. On the far left here, it says 18,600 is our budgeted enrollment number. So we, as of January of this year, are averaging just about 100 below budget. The bulk of that is in the earlier grades. So when we are projecting enrollment for the 23-24 school year next year, we are predicting that not only will we not recoup that 100 or so student loss, that will probably go down another 150 or so that we will need to plan for about 250 fewer students than what we had 2 years prior. Okay, Dr. Miner,
I'll have you pause for just a minute. By my view, no Q&A has come in, but as panelists, we can't test the Q&A. So I'm wondering if one of our attendees can just put the word test or something into the Q&A just to make sure that that's working for us, okay? Oh, lots of tests. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And so Lydia, I'll continue to monitor and you can continue to move forward.
Great, thank you. So back to general fund revenues. We talked about how enrollment drives more than 50% of our funding and just demonstrated that unfortunately enrollment is expected to decrease. We have enrollment for specific purposes. That's the Learning Assistance Program, Special Education, and Transitional Bilingual, our state special purpose, otherwise known as categorical programs, as well as transportation, which is dependent on ridership, makes up another 16.7% of our funding. So you can see that the state is responsible for over 71% of our funding in 21-22. So our local levy, which is property taxes, very important, comprises just over 15% of our total general fund revenues. Historically, our federal grants have accounted for 4 to 5% of our total revenues. We had pandemic relief funds, which are called ESSER. And in 21-22, our federal revenues were almost 10% of our total revenue picture. We expect in 23-24 that will decrease back to previous levels. And then everything else, and that includes interest income, facility rentals, meal sales, student lost book fines, everything else just represents just under 4% of our total revenue picture. And this is the same data, but just represented graphically. And then after revenues comes expenditures. So if we look at expenditures, salaries and benefits make up over 87% of our total budget. And when I say the word salaries, that's all compensation. So that might be a stipend, summer work, which is also known as temp help, a substitute, somebody's overtime. So basically all salaries, benefits, wages, payroll costs make up that 87%. So if you are familiar with McCleary, the final solution of McCleary was to increase the amount that the state gave school districts for compensation. But what happened was they were adding dollars onto a problem that hadn't been fixed. And so what has happened, and this is historical, and this is for all districts, is that the state funds a set salary for each position, and they determine the number of positions that they are going to fund based on enrollment. So salaries are higher than this average that they've established for districts. And positions aren't necessarily the same as what the state has suggested that we provide. So for instance, we have 3 categories. We have certificated instructional staff, we have certificated administrative staff, and we have everybody else who's known as classified employees. So the state did provide more funding for certificated instructional staff, and that includes not only teachers, but librarians, counselors, educational staff associates. And there is a disparity between what we get and what we pay of $27,000 for every certificated instructional staff member. For administrators, the disparity is actually about $69,000. As a result, we actually fund fewer certificated administrative staff than what the state allows. And I apologize, one moment. I am coming off a cold. So the state provides about 4 certificated administrative staff members for every 1,000 students. We actually only fund about 3.25 to 3.5 certificated administrative staff per 1,000 students because of this large disparity in what the state provides for an administrator's salary. Then for everybody who doesn't hold a teaching certificate or an administrative certificate, we're called classified. The disparity is much less. It's only about $9,600, but the state does not fund an appropriate amount of staff to run a district effectively. So we actually fund about another 120 full-time equivalent classified staff members above the state allocation. That is very common among districts in this Puget Sound corridor. That provides additional technology staff, custodians, maintenance workers, office professionals. It is a model that was originally designed in 1970s and has not been updated for classified hardly at all in the last 40 years. Then I look at some non-specific individual costs, just as an example. So for just as an example, certificated instructional substitutes cost us $2.2 million last year, and the state provided $557,000 of that cost. So the district had to absorb $1.6 million of those costs. And again, this is a world where we certainly don't want people coming in when they're sick. They should have the ability to get a substitute, but the state is woefully underfunded for that purpose. And again, sometimes when I say that, oh, we can, we use the levy for these costs outside of what the state funds, but the levy is not infinite. The levy is capped both by voters, which we are really appreciative of our voters. But what the state says is you have to collect your levy based on the higher of voter authorization or formula. And our formula is considerably less than what our voters have approved. So we have to collect less. Another problem, which is both kind of really beneficial to our employees, but also a challenge to the budget process, is how the state provides funding for wage increases. So they, fund a certain number of positions at a certain amount based on our enrollment. And then they fund increases to that amount based on currently future implicit price deflator measure, which is an economic index. Previous to this, people are more familiar with, they used to fund a COLA. They stopped funding a COLA and said, we are going to provide an increase to last year based on this IPD. So remember that $27,000 gap and the $69,000 gap. So for every 1% increase in the implicit price deflator, the district needs to fund about another $1 million out of different funds or budget reductions because the state is not funding the true cost to provide those wage increases. So I'm just going to pause there and see if there's any questions, because I know that's kind of an interesting concept. People have heard that, the state provides funding for salaries and for teachers and non-teachers, but that's not exactly accurate. They only fund an enrollment amount.
There are no questions in the box right now, but it's a good time maybe for me to jump in and give people a little bit more think time if they have any. Again, just to reiterate what Lydia said, we believe that people being able to afford to live in their community creates healthy schools and healthy communities. It's just a reality that some of that money has to come out of local dollars, the levy dollars, because the state doesn't fully fund those increases. And when that happens, when you have a budget that's approximately 87% staff, salaries and wage, in the salary and wages category, as Lydia said earlier, it makes it increasingly challenging. And still no questions, so you can continue on, Lydia.
Okay, thank you. So if payroll costs are 87%, that leaves 13%, which we call MSOCs, which are materials, supplies, and operating costs. And if you look at MSOCs, it includes things that you're familiar with in your own home, such as utilities and insurance, food, supplies. Also bus fuel for our transportation department. So there isn't a lot of discretion in the 13% MSOCs. When we look for some more discretionary items in MSOCs, people ask about travel. And if we look at last year's total travel, it was 0.06% of our total budget. And we also are required to reimburse staff for mileage when they are required to work at two or more different locations. So that's not exactly a place that we're going to see much in the way of savings. So you have revenues, expenditures, and then fund balance is basically the remainder. Hopefully it's positive. Total fund balance, it's an important number. The state auditor's office looks at it. They audit to that every year. And Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, that's OSPI, they want to make sure that districts are financially healthy enough to continue. So they do review this. We have a board policy that states that the unassigned portion must be 4% of total expenditures, or we as staff need to make a budget that restores that ending fund balance to 4%. So historically, going back to 14-15, fund balance unassigned was below that 4% target. You can see that in 17-18, it dropped to less than 1%. So that was just before I got here, but my predecessors realized that fund balance was decreasing too quickly and that we needed to do some work to restore fund balance. So if anybody was around in going into the 1920 school year, we made significant budget reductions and adjustments in the amount of about $17 million in an effort to bring us back into financial health. The other thing that happened in 1920 was the pandemic shut us down in March of 20, which, while very, very challenging for students and adults alike, was not the worst thing for us financially because a couple things. The state said, normally the state funds us based on our enrollment average over 10 months. They froze our enrollment in March of 20 as if the kids were still all in school. So that helped us. After schools closed down, we certainly didn't have substitutes or a whole lot of overtime. And then the other thing that happened was the federal government came out with pandemic relief funds. First, we started with CARES, and then that became ESSER. So for a series of a couple years, we've had both enrollment relief, hold harmless from OSPI, and federal relief funds. So looking through the end of this fiscal year, it looks like we've achieved a high of just over 5% and expect to drop to about 3.5% at the end of this school year. So recognizing that, okay, we're starting to decline, we also realize that ESSER will be materially spent by the end of this fiscal year. So we don't have relief from those funds. OSPI held us harmless for enrollment loss, not only in March of 20, but in 2021 and 21-22 last year. But they are not providing additional hold harmless funds this current fiscal year. Enrollment has declined by 800 since the 17-18 school year, and we are not expecting that to return at least in the next 5-6 years. And finally, we would have had to reduce the budget going into 2021, but the pandemic again brought us some financial relief and put all of that on hold. We furthermore, late in the budget process last year, we recognized that the legislature was implementing a catch-up provision in that implicit price deflator. So we had a very large implicit price deflator, which again was good for employees, but challenging for the district to manage that late in the year. It was 5.5%. So roughly we had to come up with another $5.5 million, which that late in last year was difficult to do. So we drew down some of the reserves to balance this year's budget. We do have some budget adjustments and some expenditures that are still not known as of today, because we have some contracts that are still being bargained. But the closed contracts, or the contracts that don't have expiration dates in 23, those contracts have been analyzed for new costs. The legislature still in session. We are not hearing that there's going to be a whole lot of legislative relief. Sometimes we just hope that there isn't any new unfunded mandates that will cost us money. So we are estimating a budget shortfall of 15 million or so. And again, some of these variables will impact that number, but that is why we are marching forward and making these presentations and trying to establish some priorities for our budget process. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Miner for a budget activity, starting with, would you like me to go one more slide?
Yeah, go ahead. So I'm going to talk you through the activity in just a moment. Erin will put the link to the activity. We can't do it in this room. We have to, I apologize, we have to get out of this room, go into a new Zoom. So she'll put the link in there. But the purpose of the activity, should you choose to join us in the next room, is to elevate priorities. And I'm going to talk about what a key function is as we consider budget planning for next year. And this is really an asset-based way to consider system alignment and adherence to our strategic plan. So if you want to go on to the next page, a key function is an action or activity that you really think is critical to our system. And as you think about the key functions, please ground your thinking in alignment to the strategic plan and the concept of student-centered. And Erin will also put a link to our website and the strategic plan into the chat as well. So I'll just give a couple of examples. A key function should not be like a position or a person. So for example, safe travel and transportation to and from schools is a key function of districts in Washington State. But bus drivers, crossing guards, dispatchers, etc., are not key functions, even though they perform critical jobs in that, right? Like we can't drive the buses without bus drivers, which is part why I give this example, because you can't have assistant superintendents driving the buses. You need to have bus drivers, but the key function would be safe travel to and from school. Another key function, a key function should be specific enough to create meaning. Like I'd like, if you say safe travel to and from schools, I understand what that means. I understand how that, who might be involved in that, who else might be able to step up and help with that. But a key function shouldn't be something like providing a world-class education to prepare students for the future, because I like to think that every single person in our system is involved in that. So it doesn't really give us enough specific information to create meaning. If you need to, you could ask yourself a couple of hows. So if I gave that statement, providing a world-class education to prepare students for the future, well, how? Then I might say, well, by, providing great instruction. How? So ask yourself the how a couple of times to get down to the key function. And then, Lydia, there is a question that we'll just take in a minute. Does Edmonds School District have debt? And you probably saw that. And if we could get to we did go on to the next one. No, one more slide, please, Lydia. And then the way we're going to do this, because this is virtual, we're not going to do this in these 3 phases. What we've done instead is create a Google Doc. And when we get to the other Zoom meeting, we'll put that into the slides, and we'll put you into Zoom rooms in triads. And then you'll be able to, I'll go over the rest of this presentation, and we'll put you in there in as close to 3s as we can get. There may be some groups of 4, maybe some groups of 2. Probably shouldn't be both because we'd have another 3, but we'll get you into those small groups, and then we will have you engage in the activity. So Leah, I'll let you take the question, and then while you're doing that, I'm going to step out and I'm going to answer, I'm going to open the next Zoom meeting for those who want to join us. Erin will leave this room open for just a couple minutes so that you can still get the strategic plan open and the Zoom room open. So I hope to see some of you soon.
Great. So the question is, does Edmonds School District have debt? And if so, how much? So going back to that debt service fund, we issued bonds based on a voter authorization in 2014. So we have outstanding bonds from a 2014, a 15, those 2 issues and some older issues. The amount of the debt is now under 300 million, and we are allowed to levy the taxpayers to pay that debt, and that is separate from the property tax revenues that I showed you in an earlier slide. So those 2 property tax assessments are completely different. The ones collected for debt have to go to debt, and the ones collected for the general fund go directly to the general fund. And if that did not answer your question, please put it right back in the chat for me, or the Q&A. Okay, so I am looking towards the Q&A and I'm not seeing any more. So oh, thank you. Okay, so our question asker's question was his connection went out. So we have approximately, yes, you heard 300 million. It's slightly under $300 million of outstanding bonds that have been used over, a bond is usually outstanding for approximately 20 years. So any bonds that we issued in, 2010, 2014 are still outstanding. And that is collected, basically 1/20th of that is collected each year by the county assessors to pay that debt down. And then again, we have a separate property tax collection for the educational programs and operations that goes straight to general fund, and those two don't mix. All right, so we are going to, you see on my screen, the steps in the process individual. We are going to move over to that other Zoom. If you want to do that activity, I will stay here for just a couple more minutes to answer any last minute questions, and then I myself am going to move over to that other Zoom. And again, I appreciate you being here tonight and listening. I'll just give it about one more minute. I still see we have some participants. So if you would like to, please go to the other Zoom. And if you aren't able to this evening, you may drop off at this time. Okay, I see two links. I have, okay, so one is a link to the Zoom and one is a link to our actual strategic plan on our website. So the strategic plan is just for your reference. You can open that up and leave it off to the side. And the other should say join Zoom meeting and has a passcode if you are not able to get directly in.